Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining. The primary objective is to make sure we give everybody a concise view in 30 minutes of what this act is about. My background, I'm a partner here in Baker Tilly. I've been with the firm since 2010. We're a top 10 firm in the US, a CPA advisory firm, and serve over 7,000 manufacturers, over 4,000 public entities, and over 1,000 utilities. And so when I joined the firm, it was just post the Obama stimulus era and a lot of the like tax credit functions that we'll talk about today. And so a lot of the inherent knowledge of what we're doing to prepare and preserve these tax credits came from our learning over the last decade plus of working on like projects. So a bit about the agenda. I want to cover off on what the IRA is, how it affects various tax credit types and how it expands it, really what those credits are and how they're earned. And then ultimately, what are the key takeaways for manufacturers? There's long runways on these things, but there's very short-term objectives that can help you preserve and maximize this credit value for your organization. So the IRA or IRA 22, it's got a few different acronyms out there, but generally we're talking about a law, an act that was signed into law a couple months ago, mid-August. 728 pages, 738 billion, $1 billion a page. So it's a very heavy act. 270 billion of the credit value or the amount of the funding was associated with energy incentives. And what's unique is that these incentives now cover 70 different energy property types. And so while this is a broad act and many of the credits go out beyond 2030 in terms of the way you can utilize them, right now, there's some immediate planning steps that if you're currently under construction or about to start construction, we hope to be able to give you some insights on how best to think of these credits. So a little bit of background on what the credits are that are covered here. There's a lot of existing credits that were enhanced and even made retroactive back to the first part of 2022. So combined heat and power, biomass, biodiesel, carbon capture, things that we've seen in many of the prior investment tax credit cycles and renewals, but new credits with bonus features, affect the manufacturing facility itself or the components being produced. There's qualifying biogas property now, which is greatly expanded. Solar, energy storage. I guess think of it this way: if you're doing anything that makes stores, reduces energy or reduces CO2, it's very likely now that or if you touch any part of the supply chain that does do those things or makes the equipment that does, it's very likely that there's something in this tax credit offering for you. So what is meant by a credit? Really, there's three ways to that these credits come about. Effectively, these credits are earned when the project is placed in service or when the product is produced, if it's a production tax credit. These credits at that point can be carried back 3 years or forward 22. So the taxpayer that actually gets the credit. What's unique about the IRA is it also allows transferability between taxpayers. And so that allows the energy property to be where it needs and have it be decoupled from maybe the people that have the tax appetite to consume the tax credit. Then lastly, it affects tax exempt owners, municipalities, et cetera. So if you're a manufacturer, unlike before, it might be that the municipality you're in itself is looking at projects like this because they can get what's called a direct pay option and effectively get the cash value of the credit as if they're a tax-paying entity. And so, really, essentially, this act is enabling all entities to utilize it regardless of their tax status. So I'm going to try to summarize the three main buckets of tax credits that exist. We're going to talk a little bit about investment tax credits, production tax credits, and excise tax credits. As we look at these, there's a lot in here, but one of my primary goals today is focus on ones that we'll get into things that have to do with what's called safe harbor or begun construction, things that have immediate action steps that need to be taken, and those are all asterisked here. And so as we go down the list and look at some of the other tax credits, 48, 48C with investment tax credit we're going to cover, 45 we're going to cover, 45Q. There is some immediate action steps here, but these are very large scale projects. It likely doesn't affect most of you, so we're going to omit discussion on that. If you are working on one, there are immediate steps we can talk about. Nuclear, it's about the only thing we haven't dealt with as a firm, but it is in here. Clean hydrogen. also has immediate steps, but usually quite large infrastructure. And then 45X, we're going to talk about a lot. 45Y and Z, these are in here and interesting, but don't begin till after 2024. So as we look at all these, there's a lot in here, but there's really a few things about today that matter. And then the excise tax credits, I'll just say if you're making fuels or using these fuels, you will have already earned it, and there aren't many planning steps. So what we're going to do is really focus this all down into 48, 48C, and 45, 45X. And then let's think about how those apply to your facilities. So as we look at those two buckets, really, if you're working on a project which helps support your energy infrastructure to run your facility, or if you're developing it as a standalone measure for ESG or other reasons, or a solar field, these projects effectively will fall into that investment or production tax credit. The other two are about your facility itself. It's inside the four walls. So 48C effectively is incremental expansion of your lines to make equipment that makes these energy properties, and 45X is the making certain components for energy properties. So let's talk a little bit about ITC and PTC and establishing what a credit value is. Both the investment tax credits and production tax credits have a base credit amount and a multiplier. And this is really unique to this act, is that they're trying to incentivize companies that use prevailing wage and apprenticeship, and for that they're giving them a 5X multiplier. Also, in addition to these base credits, depending on your domestic content, an energy community, so where you're located relative to other historical energy assets that this country's had, or if you're located in an environmental justice area, all of those can be adders. So if we look at it, there's quite a wide range of what a credit value can be. So if we look a little bit more into about the investment and production tax credits by energy type, you can see investment tax credits cover off on what are called a base credit of 6% and a base credit of 2%. Most of the 6% credits, they're trying to incentivize more. And so we're thinking about biogas property, anaerobic digesters, combined heat and power, geothermal, waste energy recovery. These are things that maybe many of your facilities today have already installed or consider building. So that base credit is 6 and has a multiplier attached to it. The other things, clean hydrogen, groundwater thermal, interconnection property, that's new. Those used to be previously excluded. And so, these can earn credits now. They're trying to open this up as broad as possible. The production tax credit ties to more the actual incremental production of a unit, specifically a kilowatt, and we'll go through examples of each. So if we look a little bit about the qualifiers for those adders, the domestic content adder, it can be 2% if you're not domestic content, or 10% if you are. Effectively, this points at the structural steel. It has to be in 100% US, and there's exemptions for that, but generally that's the intent. And then also the manufactured products themselves have certain thresholds. So we'll go through a biogas example and look at the thresholds for each of those, starting at 40% in the year 2025. So if you're building these projects, ultimately, this could be a meaningful economic benefit to the extent you're able to use that. On the energy community side, there's about 11 different criteria based on different census tracts and different vintages of census tracts, whether 2020, 2010, 2000, et cetera. But effectively what they're trying to do is say, if you're in a brown field, that's where industry used to be. If you're in economies tied to coal, oil, natural gas, historical energy sources, and those have been displaced, so if you're in those or adjacent to, you could be qualifying. And so this is a binary function. I'll say it's a mapping tool that we've built. This is the DOE's mapping tool from a webinar they gave just a couple weeks ago, and their own guidance was when IRS guidance comes out and defines exactly what these communities means, we will be able to opine on a pass fail, so to speak. But it could affect your siting decisions if you're looking at net new, or if you have multiple facilities, which one you may want to start with first. The last one's environmental justice. This is meant to be low income areas. This could be urban or rural areas, but just areas that is lower than the median wage in that census tract. Generally, the credit is 10 to 20%. The first 10% is about income. The second 10% has everything to do with an allocated value. And So maybe you can't meet domestic content. Maybe you're not in an energy community, but the project still needs assistance. It could qualify, but it's an allocated portion. This is one of a couple that are known to be allocated of the 70. Really, the rest of these are entitlements. So should you file, should you follow through, you can earn these provided you take the right planning steps. So let's just go through a quick investment tax credit example. Again, we've got a 6% base credit. This is for a biogas or an anaerobic facility. If you do nothing, don't use domestic content, aren't in an energy community, you're going to end up effectively with a 6 to a 10% credit. If you're able to meet what's called begun construction within 60 days of the guidance coming out from IRS on what prevailing wage means, you're able to meet 30%. And right now, this law passed in August. Guidance is not out on what that means for prevailing wage. I've got an appendix here that calls for comments and questions to be submitted to the IRS on November 4th. We expect as a firm, maybe a month or two from now, they'll give feedback on all the questions that they've received around what prevailing wage and apprenticeship means in the various regions of the country. So, you could reasonably expect by maybe year end that guidance to come out, and then you've got, let's say, 59 days to quote begin construction. We'll talk a lot about what that begin construction means. So if you can get that base credit and preserve begun construction, already you're at 30%. Again, add up the 2% for domestic content. If you don't meet it, you get 2%. If you do, you get 10%. So if you could work with your vendors, get a 10%, get domestic content into your project, and take proper steps for beginning construction, it's reasonable to expect that you could have a project that could get 40%. The rest, with respect to energy communities, again, this is going to be very much where you are. And the environmental justice piece, I'll just say again, is likely going to affect communities, nonprofits, more so than manufacturers, given that it's going to be allocated and target certain communities. There is a deduction here to the extent you use tax-exempt financing for a project. It does reduce the credit value, but I think for most, it's feasible to think 30 or 40% is possible on many of the energy types, these 6% ones. So looking at now the production tax credit, we're going to just look at a small scale solar property as an example, but effectively you end up with a half a penny per kilowatt as the base production tax credit. If you're able to, again, begin construction or meet prevailing wage, you can get this 5x multiplier and get it up to 2.5 cents a kilowatt. And so that starts to really close the gap on cost of the actual renewable energy property, the solar property, and maybe your retail or wholesale rates. And then all the same multipliers apply with respect to percentage increase for domestic content, the energy community, and the environmental justice. So let's talk a little bit about prevailing wage, apprenticeship requirements, and what all this means. Effectively, the intent of the law is that in each community you're to use prevailing wage, which guidance is not out on yet, but you can think of it almost like a fair and equitable wage, maybe akin to a union wage. It's going to vary by each region. Within the Act, though, it does say, to the extent prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements are met, you're going to get the tax credit. But to the extent you begin construction within 59 days of this guidance coming out, then those projects are not subject to prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. Effectively, you're grandfathered in because you've begun construction, you're already under construction, and can't change that. Also, projects that are less than 1 megawatt AC, electrical, are exempt from this. So they're not trying to burden very small scale projects. It's just to say if you're a megawatt or greater, then you would be subject to that. So how do you begin construction? Well, this comes out of a lot of the history of the prior investment tax credit work since say 2009 effectively. But there's two methods that IRS is going to look for, and effectively you can begin construction by what's called the physical work test, or physical work of a significant nature, and that can be either on-site or off-site. The other is a 5% safe harbor, and that means you're going to look at the total project cost, look at the property cost of the energy property within it, Maybe it's a $12 million project, maybe 10 million of it's qualifying energy property. So you're going to look to meet safe harbor, incur under binding written contract with vendors 5% of that 10 million or 500,000 to quote begin construction. This can allow you to begin construction on site or off site to the extent they're manufacturing critical components that are unique to your project. We tend to direct clients towards the second step. It's objective, it's measurable, it's date and time stamped. If you are under construction, it's not to say you can't use the first test, it's just not as objective. And so once you meet begun construction, you would have, and if you've done so within 59 days of this guidance come out, you will have effectively preserved that multiplier for the base credit and the adders. And so I think the key thing is here, many of you might work with prevailing wages already and might use unions. I think what's going to happen here is that as an awful lot of economic benefit is directed at projects like this, the supply chain is going to get constrained. And so if nothing else, if you're union or not already, I think meeting these provisions early will allow you to take whatever steps are required with the vendors you have in the community that you're in to keep flexibility to hold the actual construction schedule. I think otherwise, many people will be trying to work with maybe a limited number of vendors if they don't have that flexibility. There are, of course, continuous construction efforts and things like that. And, obviously in these energy projects, as you all know, it's not uncommon in these projects that, they may have a year or longer construction or longer if, the upstream facility that it's relying on for feedstock or other things actually has to ramp up as well. And so we can help you work through all that. But with respect to each project's own facts and circumstances. So let's just talk a little bit about the other bucket of credits. Now these are going to be projects that you're all entertaining, to upgrade your facility to either accommodate people in that first bucket of building projects themselves, or to simply expand your product lines and ultimately be more marketable. So the 48C is a tax credit that is an allocation. And so there is some urgency here in that it'll be first come, first serve. It's capped at 10 billion of the 270. 40% of which is allocated to factories in or adjacent to energy communities. So again, they're trying to target areas that have had displacement of other energy producing types. And so the way you should think about this is, if you're manufacturing any kind of equipment that reduces greenhouse gases, does carbon capture, if you're doing anything that is used to produce energy from sun or other natural resources, it's a very, very broad credit. But it effectively, if you're touching any part of that supply chain or making the equipment, within any of those energy types, you could qualify for an investment tax credit yourself that mirrors the amount seen earlier. So you could qualify for those same base credits, and ultimately that, let's say this 30% tax credit with the adder should you be in areas that qualify as well. So it's a pretty strong benefit, but this credit can only be used on energy property once. Meaning if you're going to elect to not make the equipment but make the components, you have to choose how you want to expand your line or which credit you want to use. Also, it should be noted that this credit ultimately does have prevailing wage requirements, and there is nothing with starting early or anything like that to be exempt from those. It will ultimately be required. So with respect to the 45X, again, this is a production tax credit, and it's meant to make more here in America. So it's got to be here. It's got to be components sold to an unrelated party. So if you're making subcomponents to yourself and doing intercompany transfers, likely doesn't qualify. This is meant for you to, effectively energize the supply chain with eligible components like for solar or inverters or batteries or wind, a lot of fasteners that help promote wind or solar, or the critical minerals. And so these become the building blocks effectively for for the energy properties that are being constructed, and you're paid on a per unit basis. What's unique about this credit too is that it's available for direct pay to all entity types. And so if you're a new manufacturer, you're coming online just to serve a unique part of the supply chain for energy equipment, and don't ultimately have tax appetite yet because of a new facility, you can still benefit from this and get direct pay. And so, we've covered a lot very quickly, but, effectively what's very different about this investment, this Inflation Reduction Act and the credits within is that there's multipliers if prevailing wage can be met. Projects that begin construction within 59 days of when the Secretary publishes guidance, will ultimately have deemed to have been met prevailing wage. And, we expect that guidance could be out tomorrow, but most likely, given the FAQs or comments that are being submitted now, it will be out near year end or 30 to 60 days from now. And so reasonably expect within, by January or February of next year that you should be under binding written contract with your vendors to have begun construction. Ultimately, taking binding written action is something that is not a casual event. You can't just put a deposit down and hope the vendor has done work. You need to actually document what they have done, show that they've done work for you, take title to it, reasonably expect to receive it within 3.5 months. There's a lot of qualifiers there. So I would say, given the benefit at stake, it's not something to take lightly, and it's not something ultimately to shortcut. Getting that proper documentation in place is critical. Ultimately, again, after safe harbors met, prevailing wage still can be used, but with the expected demand on all trade, having the opportunity to use all available labor should be beneficial. I'd say too, for projects already under construction, to the extent you're touching any of these energy types and you're not commissioning this year, should you be commissioning after January 1 of this year, you could qualify for these credits. And we're working on projects now that are half constructed, but they will get the benefit of these credits given that they do qualify and will be commissioned in 2023. The other thing too, I'd say for manufacturers that are making the equipment or the components is, there's going to be a lot of projects looking to safe harbor certain spends, 5% spends, and they're going to be saying, how domestic am I? How domestic are you, right? And so they're going to be looking to you to sell them a component that meets these domestic content thresholds. And so to the extent you're not sure of what that is, we can work with you to take your invoices, flush them through your bill of materials, and start to build up a base level of what domestic content is. We're still awaiting guidance on the exact level where it's primary or secondary within the bill of material, but these are things you've got to be known and prepared for. And I can tell you, many companies are already working with their vendors to say we at least know what is American and how much of a gap we have to cover with the remaining components to build up our project or our ultimate incremental line expansion within the factory. So at this point, it begs the question, the goal of this webinar today was to make sure we boil down those 700 plus pages into 30 minutes and make sure you understand if your facility should be taking any planning steps or affected by any of the things that are ultimately in this early guidance or an early part of the planning. So I'll leave you with how we can help. Our role is really to help end to end. This planning to meet safe harbor is, again, a very noble step, but it has to be well documented. Ultimately, you don't apply for this credit. You claim it on your tax return, and that's how you earn it. And so unless audited, there is no application process. And so a lot of these planning steps, there isn't feedback on as you're doing it under audit. If you don't have it done, ultimately can present, recapture issues with the credit itself. So taking these steps now, putting in place with us is something we help a lot of companies with. Preserving the tax credit specifically of those vendors and, meeting beyond construction on your site or on theirs is something we help document. That domestic content piece, working directly with manufacturers. The overall development advisory of the project itself or the site selection is something we can certainly help with and have done a lot. And then maximizing this tax credit, as it's going into construction, as we're starting to work with those vendors, we've got to transpose that normal schedule of values for construction, mechanical, electrical, civil into anaerobic, aerobic, et cetera, that the energy credit types to qualify for the credit, and ultimately present you with what's called a cost segregation, so that we can build up with some comfort what that credit value is. And then ultimately, somebody's got to create a work paper that your accountant will have to append to your tax return and use to claim the credits. So we've done this a lot. We've helped many companies since 2010 on this like tax credit structure, and ultimately know we can help you support this. So I thank you for your time today. Hopefully this has given you a concise overview of what the IRA is and if it can affect your company. And we look forward to working with you.